Leave!
Leave.
Night descended on Seoul with the intensity of an omen, and the distant glow of the skyscrapers reflected in the windows of the Han mansion, casting shadows that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Inside, the silence was almost palpable, interrupted only by the constant sound of rain beating against the glass, as if the sky itself mourned for someone. Han Ji-hoon, the CEO of one of Korea's largest corporations, stood before his wife, Yoon Ha-eun, with a gaze so cold it seemed capable of erasing any trace of feeling from memory. The open suitcase on the sofa was not just an object, it was the cruel symbol of the end of something that had once held promises, dreams, and love. With a firm, cutting, almost arrogant voice, he announced the arrival of Choi Min-seo, his lover, as if sealing a definitive sentence. Ha-eun watched silently as Min-seo approached with a restrained smile of victory, her sweet scent filling the room, and the touch of her hands on Ji-hoon's arm seemed to mark her territory, a silent declaration of conquest. No screams erupted, no tears fell. Ha-eun took a deep breath, understanding that fighting the cruelty of fate at that moment would be futile. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, revealing a quiet, deep pain, invisible to others, but charged with an intensity that could not be ignored. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "May fate show you the value of what you have lost." The words echoed through the heavy air like a silent premonition. Ji-hoon ascended the stairs, leaving behind a woman broken, but not destroyed. Outside, the rain fell harder, each drop seeming to register the beginning of an invisible debt that the universe would collect. But what he didn't yet know was that the price of his arrogance was only just beginning to be exacted, and that every choice he made that night could change everything. Will Ji-hoon be able to escape the consequences that have already begun to unfold before his eyes? If this opening has already piqued your curiosity, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what comes next will keep you hooked from beginning to end. The next morning, the sun rose dully over the Han mansion. The air felt heavy, and every corner of that luxurious home carried the silent echo of the previous night. Han Ji-hoon, with his impeccable suit and steely countenance, descended the stairs like a man who believed he controlled the world. His face exuded the confidence of the powerful, but behind that gaze lay the cold emptiness of someone who mistook respect for fear. Yoon Ha-eun, on the other hand, moved through the house like a serene shadow. Dressed simply, she silently prepared breakfast, even though she knew no one else was expecting her at the table. The servants, who had previously smiled at her, now averted their gazes, all aware that the new lady of the house, Choi Min-seo, had taken her place. The mistress displayed her power with subtle gestures. She sat in her wife's place, wore the jewelry that had previously belonged to Ha-eun, and treated Ji-hoon like a trophy on public display. The crumbling couple's routine continued with a semblance of normality, but every detail revealed the abysmal distance between them. Ji-hoon spent his days in meetings in downtown Seoul, surrounded by sycophants immersed in figures and contracts. He was admired and feared, but no one dared remind him that success is no shield against fate. Meanwhile, Ha-eun watched the city hustle and bustle. Through the window, feeling that silence had become her only companion. On lonely nights, she remembered the beginning of their marriage, the laughter, the promises, the hope that love could survive power. Now, only distant echoes remained of a past his pride had destroyed, yet there was something in her gaze that wasn't defeat, but patience, an almost supernatural calm, as if she were waiting for something no one else could perceive. In a corner of the kitchen, two maids whispered, believing that Ha-eun couldn't hear them. "Did you know," one said in a low voice, They say she comes from an old family with a lot of money. Impossible, the other replied nervously. If it were true, he would already know. Ha-un, without stopping the movement of her hands, continued to delicately cut the fruit. A faint smile appeared on her lips, but her eyes remained distant, as if they held a secret that time had not yet revealed. Outside, Min Seo watched the scene through the window, certain she had won. She didn't know that the brilliance of those who win through cruelty is always brief, and that behind Ha-un's silence, something much greater was about to awaken. And when Ji-hoon's pride led him to humiliate the one who loved him most, fate began to silently set the trap that would change everything. In the glass-enclosed corridors of the Han Group, the sound of Choi Min-seo's heels echoed like the announcement of a new power. Han Ji-hoon, now completely dominated by pride and vanity, had become a man who believed everything he wanted to hear. Min Seo's sweet words had become his new gospel, and any dissenting voice felt like betrayal. Between reports and meetings, she infiltrated every decision, while Vice President Kang Woo-jin watched from a distance with a discreet smile, the kind of smile of someone who manipulates the game without getting their hands dirty. It was Woo-jin who planted the seed of deception. One silent night, he brought Ji-hoon a folder of forged documents showing alleged irregular transfers signed by Ha-un. Each piece of paper was a meticulously constructed lie. She embezzled funds from the Japanese branch, Woo-jin said, with the measured tone of someone who knows the weight of words. Ji-hoon, wounded in his pride, didn't even question it. All it took was a cold look and a ruthless decision. Ha-un was banned from any involvement in the family business. The next day, Min Seo fueled the venom even further. Feigning concern, she approached him in the office and said softly, "You trusted her too much. Maybe she never loved you, only your money." The sentence, like a thin blade, pierced Ji-hoon's heart, awakening in him a desire for punishment. His arrogance finally found a purpose: to destroy the one who made him feel vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ha-un tried to understand what was happening. She noticed strange looks from the employees, heard the rumors growing, but couldn't figure out where they were coming from. One night, she found Ji-hoon in his home office and tried to speak to him, begging for an explanation. He simply raised his hand, cutting the air as if silencing an enemy. "Don't speak to me, Ha-un. You embarrassed me in front of the board." Those words were more painful than any scream. Outside, the city was still alive, but inside the mansion, time was beginning to rot. Woo-jin and Min Seo were discreetly toasting in an expensive restaurant, celebrating the downfall of a woman they didn't know how. Dangerous she was when wounded. "Soon, the Han Empire will be ours," Woo-jin said, raising his glass with a victorious smile. But fate, silent and patient, is rarely quick to reveal its plans. Every lie told that night would be the first strand of the web that would turn against them. And Ha-un, without even knowing it, was about to be pushed into the abyss that would transform her into something no one would ever dare challenge again. Because before karma arrived, fate still needed to show. Ji-hoon, how deep a betrayed soul can fall. Rain fell again on Seoul the same night. Ha-un was thrown out of the room she once called home. The sound of the raindrops mingled with the hurried footsteps of the servants, who, on Ji-hoon's direct orders, were moving her clothes to a smaller room at the back of the house. The doors slammed shut, each slam like a blow to her heart. Ha-un stood, watching silently as Min Seo, dressed in silk and expensive perfume, walked down the hallway, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had finally achieved what she desired. In the main room, Ji-hoon watched with an impassive expression. Min Seo approached him and whispered something that drew a faint, cold, cruel smile. "See how weak she is," his lover said, her voice sweet and venomous. He didn't answer. He just looked at Ha-un one last time and murmured, "Leave." before I regret being kind." It was at that moment that her love died. She gathered what little remained: a silver necklace, a yellowed photograph, and the memory of the days when his gaze still held tenderness. She walked slowly to the mansion's door, feeling the weight of each step. The cold wind blew through the hallways, extinguishing the candles and leaving the room shrouded in an almost funereal gloom. Outside, the sky seemed to weep for her, long peals of thunder, lightning cutting through the darkness. At the entrance, one of the servants, who had once respected her, looked away. None of them dared offer help. Hayun, pale-faced and lost in her gaze, walked through the gate without looking back. Behind her, the muffled sound of Min-seo's laughter echoed like a final insult. Inside the house, Ji-hoon poured himself a glass of whiskey. While his lover ran her fingers over the piano, Ha-yoon played on Lonely Nights. The melody faded into silence. Hours later, Ha-yoon was alone in a small boarding house in the suburbs. The room was simple, with peeling walls and a window that let in the cold light of the streetlights. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she held the necklace between her fingers. The tears she hadn't shed before them finally began to fall, silent and heavy. Each drop seemed to wash away the little faith she had left in love. But even amidst the pain, something inside her began to shift. Between sobs and shaky breaths, Ha-yoon realized that the humiliation hadn't broken her. It had merely transformed her. Her pain would become the fuel for something greater, something even she didn't yet understand. Hatred no longer dominated her. What was building in her chest was a calm, almost divine strength, as if fate itself was preparing her for what was to come. Across the city, Ji-hoon slept peacefully, believing he had completed a cycle. Min-seo rested beside him, contented, wrapped in expensive sheets. Little did they know that that very morning, a new story was beginning, a story written in the tears that now fell, one by one, onto the silver necklace that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. And when the silence of the night turned into absence, Ji-hoon believed he had won, without imagining that he had just lit the fuse of his own punishment. 2 days after Ha-yoon's departure, Seoul woke to a news story that was spreading throughout the city. A terrible accident had occurred on the highway to Busan. A car had plunged off a cliff and burst into flames. In the driver's seat were only fragments of glass, burnt fabric, and a partially melted silver necklace. The body, however, was never found. The press reported the case as a disappearance without a trace. For Ji-hoon, it was merely a passing inconvenience. Upon hearing the news, he simply looked up from the newspaper and said coldly, "May he rest in peace." Then he turned the page and continued reading about the company's stock. Min-seo beside him hid a smile. Inside the mansion, the mood shifted from mourning to disguised celebration. She took over the master bedroom, donned Ha-yoon's clothes, and placed the burned necklace on the vanity like a trophy. The house that once breathed love and harmony had become a stage for ostentation and deceit. The mistress was now the new Mrs. Han, and Ji-hoon believed he had erased from history the woman who had disappointed him. But somewhere in the distance, a cold breeze blew through the silent temple of a small coastal village. There, a woman with a pale face and deep eyes was awakening from a long sleep. The accident hadn't taken her. It had only freed her. Yoon Ha-yoon had survived, saved by villagers who found her unconscious body on the side of the road. She'd lost some of her memory in the first few weeks, but her heart remembered enough: the pain, the betrayal, and the emptiness. As she recovered, memories came to her in fragments: Min-seo's laughter, Ji-hoon's cold gaze, the house that now belonged to others. Each image rekindled something that had lain dormant, the wounded dignity of a betrayed woman. When her memory finally returned completely, Ha-yoon looked out to sea and whispered, If fate doesn't forget, neither do I. Months passed. Ji-hoon immersed himself even deeper in his work, believing his empire was secure. The Han Group was thriving, and Min Seo proudly displayed the luxury she had acquired. But the real irony was about to begin. A mysterious box was delivered to the main office. Inside, a golden brooch gleamed in the morning light, the ancient symbol of Yoon family, an ancient lineage, richer and more influential than the Han Empire itself. Ji-hoon held the object disdainfully, unaware that the small golden emblem was the first piece of fate in motion. At the same moment, Ha-eun left the village with a determined look in her eyes, the wind blowing in her face, as if the entire universe were announcing her return. Because destiny, before punishing, always returns silence. And in Ha-eun's silence, the karma that would come to collect everything began to be born. The following weeks were marked by a succession of misfortunes that no one within the Han Group could explain. A major international contract was suddenly cancelled. Investors began withdrawing their shares, and rumors of corruption spread like wildfire through the corridors of the Seoul Stock Exchange. Han Ji-hoon, accustomed to controlling every variable, watched his empire crumble before his very eyes without understanding how. The arrogance that had once made him seem unshakable now blinded him to what was happening around him. Min Seo, who had promised her unconditional support, began to quietly withdraw. She no longer waited for him for dinner, no longer smiled when he arrived. Her cold eyes watched him with contempt, and her every word felt like a cruel reminder that power is a fragile mirror. "You're losing everything, Ji-hoon," she said one night, with the calm of someone already planning her escape. "Maybe it's time to admit that you weren't born for the top." He didn't respond. He just clenched his fists. Feeling the ground begin to give way, the board of directors pressured him. The press questioned his leadership, and his former allies treated him with the same indifference he once showed the woman he loved. However, it was in the silent early mornings that the punishment became most evident. Ji-hoon began to have recurring nightmares. He would see Ha-eun in the rain, reaching out for him, but every time he tried to reach out, she disappeared into the mist. He would wake up, sweating, breathing heavily, with a racing heart and an inexplicable sense of guilt. One morning, upon entering his office, he found an old letter on his desk, written in delicate handwriting. The paper was slightly yellowed, and the faint scent betrayed its origin. Ji-hoon's hand trembled as he read the first words. "Nothing is eternal, Ji-hoon. Not power, not love, not arrogance. Everything you took from me, life will find a way to give back." He threw the letter on the table, trying to convince himself it was a joke, but something inside him began to crumble. That same day, an official investigation froze his bank accounts. The Han Empire was officially in crisis. Woo Jin, the vice president, disappeared, taking a portion of the company's funds with him. Min Seo was seen leaving a hotel with confidential documents. Ji-hoon realized too late that he had been betrayed by everyone he thought he controlled. That night, alone in the dark office, he looked out the window and saw his own reflection. His tired face, his empty eyes, his pride shattered. The city shone outside, indifferent to his downfall. The rain began again, as if time were returning to the moment it all began. And as Ji-hoon tried to understand what had happened, a woman walked through the streets of Seoul, her face hidden under a black umbrella and a serene gaze. Her steps were slow but steady. With each flash of lightning, the reflection of the Yoon family's golden brooch glinted on her coat. Because fate, patient as time, was about to reveal its face, and the reunion between victim and tormentor would change everything Ji-hoon believed about power, love, and forgiveness. It was a cold morning in Seoul when the Han Group, now reeling and seeking rescue, received an unexpected invitation to the biggest corporate event of the year. Yoon Holdings, a mysterious conglomerate that had been quietly dominating the Asian market, was to announce its new presidency at a luxurious hotel on the banks of the Han River. For Ji-hoon, this represented a chance to find allies and perhaps rebuild what remained of his empire. He donned his most expensive suit, trying to hide beneath the costly fabric the exhaustion of someone who had lost everything, his power, his prestige, and without realizing it, his very soul. The lights in the main hall reflected off the hanging crystals, and guests whispered between glasses and forced smiles. Ji-hoon arrived accompanied by Min Seo, who exuded an almost insolent confidence. "Today, it could be a new beginning," she whispered, feigning affection, but her eyes wandered toward Woo Jin, who discreetly observed the event from afar. Ji-hoon didn't notice the theatrics, as he was focused on the stage, where an elegant host announced the arrival of Yoon Holdings' new president in a firm voice. The lights dimmed. A golden beam crossed the room and illuminated the center of the stage. The sound of footsteps echoed, slow, measured, steady. When the female figure emerged into the spotlight, there was absolute silence. Dressed in white, her hair pinned impeccably and her gaze as cold as winter, Yoon Ha-yoon reappeared before everyone, alive, untouched, transformed. Ji-hoon stood still. The blood seemed to drain from his body. Min Seo gasped, clutching his arm tightly. The woman they both believed dead now descended the stairs with the elegance of someone who had never needed permission to exist. Her presence dominated the room like an ancient force. Every eye turned to her, and with each step, past humiliation became power. Hyun walked to the podium, looked at the business people, and with a slight smile announced, "Starting today, Yoon Holdings assumes controlling interest in the Han Group." A murmur filled the room. Ji-hoon felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He tried to stand, but his body felt trapped. Ha-eun's face showed no anger, only serenity. She stared at him briefly, and in that look was something more painful than hatred, the recognition of indifference. As she spoke, Min Seo tried to hide her panic. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, but Woo Jin was no longer there. Her manipulative partner had disappeared, taking with him all that remained of her secret accounts. Ji-hoon finally realized how much he had been deceived by everyone. At the end of the event, Ha-eun walked past him calmly, her light perfume filling the air. "Good afternoon, Mr. Han," she said with clipped politeness, without even looking him directly in the eye. Ji-hoon tried to respond, but his voice was lost. It was as if time had stopped, allowing him to feel the weight of every tear she had ever shed. The hall slowly emptied. Ji-hoon sat motionless, watching the woman he once despised being applauded as a symbol of power and rebirth. Pride, once his armor, was now a prison. For the first time, he understood what it means to be small before the greatness of someone who was wounded, but not destroyed. As Ha-eun entered the limousine, the news cameras captured the moment she stared out the window, emotionless, watching Ji-hoon in the distance, a man lost in his own emptiness. But the reunion wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the reckoning. Because the true punishment isn't losing the empire, but facing the gaze of those who survived its contempt. That night, the Han Group's main office was empty, except for Han Ji-hoon, who stood alone before the panoramic window, gazing at the reflection of the city that no longer belonged to him. The lights of Seoul flickered like small, luminous wounds, reminding him of the power that was now only a memory. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand, not from drunkenness, but from the guilt that was finally seeping in, slow and corrosive. Each drop that ran down the bottle seemed to echo the seconds of an invisible sentence being silently fulfilled. The sound of the door opening pierced the heavy air. He turned, expecting to see some employee, perhaps a messenger, but stopped. The figure crossing the threshold walked with calm, steady steps. Yun Ha-un stood there, wrapped in an elegant black coat, her gaze serene, yet distant, as if nothing in this place mattered anymore. Ji-hoon held his breath. The words died before they even reached his mouth. She approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "I never imagined I'd return to this office," she said, her voice low and precise. "But there's something I've learned over time. Silence speaks." Louder than any shout, Ji-hoon took a step toward her, trying to find a glimpse of the past in her eyes, but all he saw was a cold, impenetrable mirror. "Ha-un, I was wrong." Her voice sounded like a shaky whisper. "I was deceived, manipulated. No," she interrupted, elegantly raising a hand. "You believed what you wanted to believe. Pride has always been your most faithful lover, Ji-hoon. Min Seo only used what you already offered, your vanity." The silence between them was almost unbearable. The rain began to fall outside, echoing the sound of the night. Everything fell apart. Ha-un looked around, observing the table where so many bad decisions had been made. "This place smells of the same poison that once made me sick. But today, I don't feel angry. I feel sorry." Ji-hoon approached her, desperate, seeking a redemption he couldn't even name. "Do you still hate me?" he asked, his eyes brimming with tears. She looked away and calmly replied, "Hate is a luxury only the weak can afford. I learned to live without you, Ji-hoon. That was my greatest triumph." He tried to touch her, but she took a step back. The gesture was small, but enough to separate them by an impossible gulf. For a moment, his breath hitched. Ha-un turned slowly and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused and said, "Your punishment isn't losing what you have. It's living the rest of your days, remembering what you destroyed with your own hands." The door closed softly, the sound echoing through the office like a gavel striking a final sentence. Ji-hoon stood there motionless, his hands trembling, his heart weighing more heavily than all the buildings of his lost fortune. Outside, Ha-un walked in the rain, her black umbrella reflecting the streetlights. The wind lifted her hair, and each step felt like an omen, the prelude to a justice that had not yet been served. Because fate, even after forgiveness, always holds the final blow. And true karma still had something to give back. The following days were a slow-motion collapse. News spread across Seoul's headlines. Financial scandal at Han Group. Vice Chairman flees with millions. CEO's mistress implicated in international fraud. Each headline was a public stab, and Ji-hoon, who had once held the spotlight, was now the portrait of a corrupt empire. The same press that had venerated him now devoured him mercilessly. Min Seo tried to deny the accusations, but evidence, recordings, and offshore accounts soon surfaced. Authorities led her away in handcuffs under the curious gaze of the crowd. In that scene, reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs illuminated her pale face, and she, trembling, could only say, "He believed everything I wanted." The sentence echoed like a cruel sentence in Ji-hoon's heart as he watched on television, alone, inside the now silent mansion. Woo Jin, the man who had once been his confidant, had completely disappeared, taking not only the money, but also the company's reputation. Creditors stormed the offices, demanding explanations. The Han name, once synonymous with prestige, had become a source of scorn and ridicule. Ha-un, watching from a distance, remained serene. There was no vengeance in her eyes, only a deep melancholy, the look of someone who understands that destiny needs no rush. While Ji-hoon tried to rebuild what was left, she watched from afar, letting time do what it promised, to return, with precision, all that he sowed. That night, Ji-hoon returned to his old house, now empty. The wind blew through the hallways, lifting curtains like ghosts. Ha-eun's piano was covered in dust, and on it lay the silver necklace she'd left behind, intact, glinting faintly in the cold moonlight. He took it in his hands and broke down, crying for the first time in years. Each tear falling to the floor seemed to carry the weight of his past arrogance. Outside, the rain began again, and thunder rumbled as if the sky itself witnessed the end of a reign. Ji-hoon knelt on the ground, exhausted, whispering her name through sobs no one else would hear. In that moment, he understood that the true punishment was not material ruin, but the eternal loneliness of those who destroyed the love that could have been their salvation. As he wept, Ha-eun crossed a bridge illuminated by the city lights. In the water's reflection, her face remained serene. The wind gently ruffled her black coat, and a look of compassion crossed her eyes. Not out of love, but out of finality. Because before silence brought peace, there was still one last scene to be written, and in it, Ha-eun would show that forgiveness can be more ruthless than any revenge. Redemption, the ultimate gesture of forgiveness. 500 words. Dawn arrived shrouded in dense fog, and for the first time, Han Ji-hoon didn't feel like opening the curtains. The house was plunged into an almost sepulchral silence, the air heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. The walls, which had once reflected success and power, now held only the hollow sound of his own regrets. When the phone rang, he answered it hoarsely, never imagining that this would be the beginning of his final reckoning. "There's someone waiting for you at the old headquarters," the security guard said. Ji-hoon was silent for a moment before replying, "Tell him I'm on my way." Arriving at the empty building, the smell of old wood mingled with the dust. The office where he had made ruthless decisions seemed smaller, almost unrecognizable. On the desk sat a brown folder and a lone white rose. He opened the envelope and found a letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately. "It's not ruin that defines a man, Ji-hoon. It's what he does after it. I didn't come to collect, I came to free. The debt between us is ended." Ha-eun's voice broke the silence behind him. She was there, standing in the doorway, with the same calm, untouchable gaze of someone who has learned to master their own pain. Ji-hoon turned, and his eyes instantly filled with tears. "You won," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I lost everything." "I didn't want you to lose," she replied calmly. "I wanted you to understand the value of what you never bought. Loyalty, love, respect." He approached slowly, almost pleading. "Why didn't you destroy me completely? You had the power to do so." Ha-eun smiled, but it was sad, almost compassionate. "Because forgiveness is the revenge of those who no longer need hate. I already won when I stopped hating you." She placed her hand on the papers and gently pushed them toward him. "Sign, and go in peace." Ji-hoon looked at the contract. It was the symbolic transfer of all remaining Han Group shares to Yoon Holdings, an act of total surrender. He signed, and when he looked up, Ha-eun was already walking away. In the reflection of the window, he saw her walk through the morning mist, slowly disappearing like a benevolent ghost completing its mission. But destiny still held one last image in store. A poetic closure where time, pain, and love would meet to close the cycle with the dignity that only silence can offer. The weeks passed like a distant whisper, and Han Ji-hoon's name faded from the headlines, replaced by silence, the same silence he once imposed on those he loved most. Ha-eun, now at the helm of Yoon Holdings, dedicated herself to her work serenely, never once uttering his name. To the world, she was the woman who rose from the ashes. To herself, she was simply someone who finally understood the value of her own silence. On a grey afternoon, she climbed to the building's terrace. carrying a folder of documents and a small velvet box. The sky was heavy but calm, and the cool air carried the scent of flowers from the corporate garden. When she opened the box, there was the silver necklace, the same one that had once shone amidst her pain. She stared at it for long seconds, and then, without hesitation, dropped it onto the table. The sound of metal hitting glass echoed softly, like a restrained goodbye. Ha-yun took a deep breath. There was no bitterness, no regret. What remained was only gratitude. The woman who had been humiliated now understood that suffering, though cruel, had been the teacher who taught her the power of self-love. Revenge had dissolved into compassion, and the wound that had nearly destroyed her had become her crown. Across the city, Ji-hoon wandered the streets aimlessly, gazing at shop windows he could no longer afford, hearing laughter that no longer belonged to him. With every step, he remembered Ha-eun's voice, not the sad voice of an abandoned woman, but the serene firmness of someone who had learned to live without fear. For the first time, he understood what he had truly lost, not his wife, but the woman fate had sent to teach him humility. As the sun disappeared between the buildings, Ha-eun turned her gaze to the horizon. The last rays of light touched her face, and a faint smile formed. Love, she thought, was never about possession, but about learning. And sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the past, without resentment and without return. But even when everything seemed to find rest, destiny still held one last scene in store. The gentle echo of a farewell that would seal once and for all the cycle between pain, forgiveness, and eternity. Night fell over Seoul like a dark, silent veil, enveloping every corner, every building, and every soul still carrying old wounds. The city lights reflected off the wet streets, casting diffuse glows that seemed to shimmer with a contained sadness, almost as if each reflection were a memory of moments that could never be recovered. The distant sound of cars, mixed with the echo of the wind along the avenues, created a melancholic melody that accompanied Han Ji-hoon on his solitary steps. He walked down the same street where, years before, he had taken Ha-eun for the first time, a walk that night seemed to carry the weight of all the mistakes, all the hasty choices, and all the pride that had blinded him to true love. Each step reminded him not only of the woman he had lost, but also of the opportunity to become someone better, someone capable of loving without letting pride guide his life. The man who once believed he had conquered everything now carried only the weight of his own decisions, and each reflection of the lights in the puddles seemed to echo the silent question forming inside him. Was it too late to learn? In a discreet cafe, whose windows were fogged by steam and the still timidly falling rain, Ji-hoon stopped in front of the window and gazed at his distorted reflection in the glass. His suit, once impeccable and a symbol of power, was wrinkled. His sunken eyes reflected sleepless nights and a heart weary with silent guilt. His former haughtiness, the confidence that intimidated and fascinated at the same time, had been replaced by a serene sadness, almost painful to observe. Inside the cafe, a young woman smiled at her boyfriend, with the innocence and sparkle in her eyes that a carefree life allows. The scene, so simple, pierced Ji-hoon like an invisible knife, reminding him of what pride had destroyed, of what he had lost forever, and of how thoughtless choices can leave scars that time alone cannot heal. He turned, faced the overcast sky, and let the rain touch him, as if fate itself wanted to wash him one last time of the remnants of vanity, arrogance, and ego that had accompanied him throughout his life. Each cold drop that ran down his face seemed to whisper secrets from the past, reminding him of every tear he hadn't shed, every word he hadn't said, and every gesture of love he lost to pride. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Ha-eun was closing her workday in her warmly lit office, creating a welcoming contrast to the cold, rainy night outside. She slowly closed the curtains, watching the wind rustle the papers on her desk. And for a moment, she allowed herself to think of Ji-hoon, but that memory held no pain, not anymore. Instead, it was a glimpse of silent compassion, an acknowledgement that time, when used well, teaches lessons the heart alone cannot grasp. "May time teach you what love could not," she whispered to herself, and in the gentleness of her gesture, in the pause in her breath, there was an acceptance that life goes on, that the past is a lesson, and that the future is a space yet to be conquered. The clock struck midnight, and the city seemed to sigh along with her as the cycle finally came to an end, not with tears, not with screams, but with the serenity that only maturity and understanding can offer. Outside, the rain stopped, and silence filled the streets, interrupted only by the distant sound of a few drops still escaping from the trees. The city lights reflected in the puddles, creating distorted but beautiful images, as if the city itself wanted to paint a picture of new beginnings and hope. Ha-eun walked toward the elevator, each step firm, filled with confidence and serenity. As she closed the doors, the soft sound of the wind mingled with her calm breathing, creating a moment of silent communion with the world around her. The past, with all its weight and pain, had fallen silent, and the future stood free, ready to be written anew, free from the shackles of past mistakes, free from the shadows of hurt that once insisted on lingering, while Ha-eun found peace in rebuilding her life. Ji-hoon still walked alone, learning with each step the value of what he had lost. Every reflection, every person he passed, every gesture of love from others brought him a reminder. Pride and arrogance can build empires, but it is compassion and forgiveness that keep the bonds that truly matter alive. He had lost the woman he loved, but he also found in the wet streets and reflected lights the opportunity to understand that nothing, not money nor power, replaces what the heart does not forget. Time finally became a silent ally, teaching him that regret is only valid if accompanied by understanding, and that every choice has consequences that, sooner or later, must be faced with courage. The imaginary camera zooms out, revealing the entire city in silence, with wet streets, dim lights, and trees swaying gently in the early morning breeze. Every detail, from the breeze sweeping through the avenues to the reflection of lamps in puddles, creates an atmosphere of new beginnings. And hope, the viewer senses that, although the cycle has ended, the lessons remain, and that those who learned from the past now carry the capacity to love more wisely, forgive more deeply, and live more lightly. And then, the narrator's voice returns, deep and serene, full of meaning. If you believe that destiny always demands every tear and returns every justice in due time, subscribe to the channel now and continue following our stories. Because here, every pain has a purpose, every fall has a meaning, and every wounded soul finds rebirth. Each episode is a reminder that true love, even when lost, leaves marks that time will never erase, and that forgiveness has the power to free hearts and transform lives forever. As the screen slowly fades to black, only silence and a sense of peace remain, and the viewer is left with the certainty that even after the greatest pain, there is always room for rebuilding, for learning, and for the hope that arises from every choice made, every regret felt, and every forgiveness offered. The story comes to an end, but the message remains. Loving, making mistakes, learning and forgiving are inevitable parts of a life worth living, and it is in this cycle that true rebirth is revealed.